Hello everybody, welcome back to the second of 5 short videos. We're thinking about the history of care and welfare. I'll think about early caring, early welfare, and I'm going to use the idea of compassion. I'll explain why in a minute. Investigating human nature. Compassion. Well, this book has inspired this presentation. The title in particular I found utterly fascinating. It's one of the more interesting recent reviews of the global history of welfare and social policy. What an interesting title. Finkel investigates a long history of social welfare, really going back to the beginning of man. In this recent text, discuss with your partner, do you like the title? If so, why? Is it interesting to think of welfare and care in terms of compassion? So here you are, pause here, natter with your partner. What do you think of this compassion idea? Maybe I can help you with the answer simply by investigating the word compassion. My Oxford English Dictionary tells us it's sympathetic pity and concern for the sufferings or misfortune of others. And in terms of the etymology, comes from the Old French, originally from Latin, the idea of suffering with others, suffering with others. Maybe that explains why I find this term so interesting. In our last video, we discussed the idea of care, and we had the idea of care about and care for. We care for each other. We care for our children. We care for older people. We care for disabled people. And we care for people because we care about people. You know, as a society, we are interested in the welfare of others. You may be a stranger, but your welfare interests me, and we'll have shared services to meet your welfare needs and mine. So this is a fascinating idea. We really do care about others. We care about the welfare of others. We have sympathy with other human beings. And that's why I find that book has an absolutely wonderful title. And it's a nice kickoff point for that author's investigation of the development of social policy globally. Let's think about the beginnings, the birth of care, the birth of welfare. Discuss with your partner, what are the historical origins of care and of welfare, of care and organised welfare? What early welfare do you think of when I say early welfare? Going back a really, really long time, what do you first think of? And I've got a Wikipedia image there of a painting from the 1600s, maybe to help you in your head scratching. Pause here and discuss with your partner. What did you come up with? Finkel's argument is really, really interesting. Finkel's fascinated by the way in which human beings have this instinct to care for one another. Finkel notes how sharing and caring, it's a nice phrase, is as old as humanity itself. Neanderthal skeletons show signs of disabled individuals being cared for by others. So we didn't leave, our sick or our disabled. We looked after them. We looked after them, collectively pooling our resources. So in a sense, this is something that we were doing before we were first properly Homo erectus. It's one of the oldest parts of our humanness, so to say. Finkel then looks at the questions of the warlike nature of early man. And there's a kind of myth that human history is a series of long, uninterrupted wars. Finkel wants to get behind that. He's questioning these assumptions, also the assumption of human beings being male-dominated. And actually, there's evidence from anthropology to disprove both of those two claims. Human beings were not always at war with one another, and human beings were not always dominated by males oppressing females. That really isn't how human history as a species works. So it's quite interesting to shake up some stereotypes that we may have about human beings in earlier times. Probably doesn't answer my original question in terms of what you were thinking of, scratching your heads and looking at the painting on my last slide. Let's go back to this painting. I'm guessing this painting was alluding to religious understandings of care. Look at the world's religions. For many examples of early care come from our region's religions. I'm speaking here in Germany, in Europe. We immediately think of Christianity to orientate ourselves in this question of care. And my illustration is, of course, illustrating the Good Samaritan. This is the Good Samaritan. You're seeing the Good Samaritan has found this poor soul who's been robbed and attacked. He's being the good neighbor. Comes from our Gospel of Luke. The good neighbor helping the needy. And I think Christianity really is an orientation point for us. We can think of other examples. Matthew 25, those who inherit the earth are those having given charity. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. So some basic acts of care here. So human beings give charity, and that charity may well be linked to their religion. Again, thinking of Catholicism in Europe in the Middle Ages, for example. So a European would relate the history of care to church care. In Europe in the Middle Ages, helping the poor, disabled and needy, it was seen primarily as private charity. This is what the church did whenever it could. Indeed, it's what a Catholic Christian would have done to express their faith, helping the needy. You know, this is a wonderful opportunity for me to prove my belief. And the church really was the key provider of institutionalized support in that period. And we had early hospitals. This illustration from Germany in the 1600s is actually quite a modern looking hospital. These are sick people in bed being cared for using the medical science and the nursing science of the time. In earlier times, the word hospital was quite unclear in its meaning. It meant very much a place for the homeless as much as a place for healing. So hospitals for the poor, which slowly shifted into almshouses and other similar places. And indeed, the church would be the main institution administering alms, you know, giving food or financial support if need be. And we had a fairly robust and a fairly stable system of care in place in Europe. The church was spread, and there was a lot of this church care. The system, though, had to be reformed. And looking at this from a British perspective, going back to Britain in the 1500s, I think this is the time where we have the first really interesting example of institutionalized care on an especially large scale. During the 1500s in England, various factors led to the system being reformed. Which factors exactly? Scratch your head and natter with your partner here. Try and trace back in history. For orientation, this is the Tudor period. I'm going to talk about the Tudor period in my next presentation, the Tudor period, and also Queen Elizabeth, that followed on from her father Henry VIII. What do you remember about that period? This is also, the later part of this period is also the time of Shakespeare. So again, maybe you've watched films, maybe you have knowledge of that historical period. What exactly was going on in society at that point? What did you come up with? There's a number of reasons of reforming the services. Going back to that period, we're kind of thinking of the Renaissance, aren't we, really? There was a lot of change. There was a lot of economic growth. Again, if you watch films set in that period, you'll notice this, you know, to some extent, England was booming. Economic growth brings with it population growth, but we then had a series of bad harvests, which of course was utterly devastating in these fragile economies, largely rural economies, of course. We had bad harvests, we had economic problems, we had price inflation as well. I'm listing these three factors. Maybe these three factors are underplayed when people talk about reasons for the reform of the care for the poor and the needy. While we talk about changing that system I've just described, the last point's often given the most weight. Britain converted to Protestantism. England had this new religion, and the religion of Protestantism looked at the act of almsgiving and looked at the role of work in our lives in quite a different way. And that intellectually stimulated a new approach to managing the poor. I'm going to come to a close here. We're going to return to this topic of managing the poor, and I'm going to look at that Tudor and that Elizabethan period in more detail in my next presentation. Thanks for listening, everybody. Cheerio.